Mark stepped off the transport shuttle onto the gleaming floor of the massive intergalactic station. The air smelled of ionized metal and distant stars. The hum of engines and voices filled the vast corridors of the station. But it was the silence of anticipation that truly caught his attention. His eyes flicked around the bustling area, taking in the unfamiliar mix of species, humanoid and non-humanoid alike. Their voices were a constant background to his thoughts, but none of them truly registered. It was all background noise to the singular reason he had come here, the whispers of Zylra, the Valthar ambassador, whose presence had captivated even the most seasoned diplomats and traders of the galaxy. She was the talk of every corner of the station. Her name dropped in hushed tones like a secret passed between allies. No one spoke openly of her beauty, but everyone knew it was said that to see her was to feel something deep in your chest, a magnetic pull that made every word feel inadequate. The stories claimed that her beauty was so otherworldly it made stars seem dim by comparison, and that no one left her presence unchanged. Mark had heard all of it, the rumors, the legends, but now that he was here on the station, he didn't quite know what to believe. The stories painted her as untouchable, being out of reach, not just in appearance, but in every sense of the word. She was an enigma, and the more he heard about her, the more he felt drawn in. But there was another part of him that felt a sense of rebellion, a thought that maybe beauty shouldn't hold such power. Maybe there was something more to her, something that could be understood outside of the stories and the myths. As he wandered through the station, his mind kept drifting back to the Valthar ambassador. He had heard that she spent much of her time in the central lounge, a place where diplomats and influential figures met to discuss trade and alliances. It was a place where people gathered to make deals and exchange secrets. But Mark wasn't interested in the politics. He wasn't a diplomat or a trader, he was an engineer. And yet he couldn't help himself. His curiosity pulled him toward that lounge, as though some unseen force was guiding him. When he arrived, the scene inside was nothing like he had imagined. It was grander, more chaotic, and yet strangely controlled. The room was alive with conversations and the clink of glasses. But there was one presence that made everything else feel secondary. Mark saw her instantly, even across the room. Her silver skin shimmered under the artificial lighting. Her eyes, like polished metal, stared out across the space with a calm that seemed to challenge the chaos around her. She wasn't just another ambassador or diplomat. She was something else entirely. And for the first time since arriving, Mark felt that strange sense of weightlessness. The stories were true. She commanded the room without lifting a finger. Every conversation seemed to pivot around her. Every glance that passed in her direction was filled with an unspoken reverence. As he took a hesitant step forward, he couldn't deny that there was something magnetic about her. But it was more than just her appearance. It was the way she held herself, the way her presence seemed to stretch beyond the physical into something far deeper. And before he realized it, he found himself standing just a few feet away. His heart pounded in his chest. And without thinking, he spoke the words that had been on his mind since he had first heard about her. "You look beautiful today." He said the words, slipping out before he could stop them. The moment the words left his mouth, Mark immediately regretted it. Her eyes flicked toward him, and the world seemed to stop. She didn't smile. She didn't even acknowledge his presence in the way he expected. Instead, her gaze seemed to cut through him like a blade, as though she could see straight into his soul. Mark's heart thudded in his chest, and he stood frozen, his mind scrambling for something to say, something that would make the situation less awkward. But the silence between them grew unbearable, and the weight of her stare became even more intense than he could have imagined. She said nothing for a long time, and Mark wondered if she would even respond at all. Just as he started to open his mouth to apologize or offer some explanation, she finally spoke, her voice soft but ice cold. "You think you can measure beauty, human?" She said the words slowly, as though savoring their bitterness, each syllable landing heavily on the air and causing Mark's stomach to tighten. Her tone wasn't just questioning, it was challenging, and Mark felt an unexpected pang of discomfort. He hadn't meant for it to come across as anything other than a compliment, but in the silence that followed, he began to wonder if it had been a mistake. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain his composure. "I didn't mean to offend. I just meant that you look." His words trailed off because the moment he spoke, he realized that he had no idea what he had meant to say. The situation felt wrong on so many levels. She wasn't responding like anyone he had ever met, and the coldness in her eyes felt like an accusation, something far more layered than just a simple reaction to a comment. Her gaze narrowed as she took a small step closer. Her presence felt even more overwhelming, up close, like gravity itself had shifted around her, and everything else faded into the background. "You must not understand," she said softly, her voice low, but filled with an edge of something darker. "Beauty is a tool, nothing more." Mark blinked as her words sank in. He had heard the stories about her species and how they were known for their appearance, how they were said to use their beauty to manipulate others, to influence entire civilizations. But hearing her say it aloud felt different. It didn't feel like the casual gossip he had heard from other travelers. It felt real. It felt personal. Her expression didn't change as she continued. "It's a mask, a weapon, a form of control," her voice barely above a whisper, but the weight of her words felt like a bomb ticking quietly in the room. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak again, she turned away and walked off into the crowd without a second glance. He stood there, rooted to the spot, his mind reeling with confusion and something else he couldn't quite place. It was as though the world had shifted under his feet, and he was left standing in a place that didn't quite make sense. The exchange had been so brief and yet so heavy. He didn't know what he had expected when he spoke to her, but it certainly hadn't been that he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter had just opened a door to something far more complex than he had imagined. Mark spent the next few days on the station, lost in thought, unable to escape the haunting memory of his brief encounter with Zylra. Her words echoed in his mind. "Beauty is a tool, nothing more. Beauty is a mask, a weapon." It all felt like a riddle, but he couldn't crack. Every time he tried to think about it logically, the answer slipped further away. Each time he saw her from a distance, he couldn't help but feel the strange pull of her presence, the way she seemed to control the room without saying a word, how others would look at her with an odd mixture of admiration and fear. It was almost as if they were afraid to acknowledge that there was more to her than what appeared on the surface. But Mark wasn't like the others. He didn't come from a background that bowed to beauty or power. He was an engineer, a man who valued systems and logic. But there was something about Zylra that made logic feel insignificant. Everything about her screamed that there was more beneath the surface, something deeper, something dangerous. He watched her from afar over the next few days, noticing how everyone seemed to shift around her. People would fall silent when she entered a room. Even the most powerful figures aboard the station seemed to bend their will to her in some subtle way. She moved like a shadow, effortlessly gliding through spaces, commanding the attention of everyone in her vicinity. But it wasn't just her presence that intrigued him. It was the way she moved, like she didn't need anyone's approval or permission. She wasn't beholden to anyone's idea of beauty or power. But Mark couldn't help but think that maybe she was playing a game that he didn't fully understand. There was a meeting one afternoon that would change everything. Mark had learned that Zylra would be attending a high-level diplomatic exchange in the central lounge, and for the first time since his awkward interaction with her, he decided to attend not as an observer, but as someone who might actually speak to her again. He wasn't sure why he had made the decision, but he knew he had to see her again to try and understand her better, to understand what had driven her to speak to him the way she did. He didn't want to just be another face in the crowd. He needed answers. And maybe this would be his chance. He made his way through the station's crowded halls and into the lounge. His pulse quickened as he spotted her standing by a long table covered with data pads and holographic screens. She was in the middle of a conversation with several diplomats, but Mark couldn't tear his gaze away. There was something magnetic about her that made it hard to focus on anything else. As he walked closer, he felt the weight of the room shift and realized that everyone was waiting for her next move, as if she held the key to everything around them. Mark's feet moved almost of their own accord, and before he knew it, he was standing just a few feet away from her. He hesitated for only a moment, but then he stepped forward. This time, he wouldn't back down. He would find out what made her tick. He would understand what she was really trying to say. The moment his foot touched the ground, Zylra turned her head, her silver eyes meeting his once again. And just like that, the air shifted. Everything else around them became a blur of noise and movement, and Mark was left standing at the center of it all, his heart pounding in his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but for the first time he couldn't find the words. Mark stood there, his mouth dry, and his mind racing as Zylra's gaze pierced through him like a blade. He had rehearsed this moment a dozen times in his head, but now that he was here, the words wouldn't come. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Every other voice in the room seemed to fade into the background. Mark's hands clenched into fists at his sides, unsure of what to do. He could feel the eyes of the diplomats around them, watching his every move. But there was something else too, something more primal, a sense that the world was waiting for Zylra's response, that everything hinged on her decision, whether she would acknowledge him or dismiss him as insignificant. Her gaze lingered for a moment longer before she broke at her eyes, shifting to the group she had been speaking with. And just like that, the weight in the room shifted again. She had dismissed him without a word. Mark could feel his chest tighten. But he didn't move. He stayed rooted to the spot, staring at her as she continued her conversation with the others, as though he wasn't even there. A part of him wanted to turn away, walk out of the lounge, and never think about this moment again. But another part of him refused to let go. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to back down now. He needed to understand why she had responded to him the way she did, what it was about her that made everything feel so complicated, and for that he needed answers. And so he took a step forward, ignoring the looks from the other people in the room. And when he was close enough, he spoke her name softly, Zylra. She didn't flinch at the sound of it. In fact, she didn't even look at him. Instead, she simply let her hand rest on the table, her posture perfect and unmoving. But her voice came as a quiet hum. "You still don't understand." The words were calm, but they held a warning, something deeper hidden beneath the surface. Mark's heart skipped a beat, his mind scrambled for a response. But before he could find one, she spoke again, her voice carrying a tone of finality. "I told you before, beauty is a tool, nothing more. It's a way of controlling those around you, manipulating them into doing what you want. But you humans are so obsessed with it, so focused on what's seen on the outside, that you never stop to question the motives behind it. You only see the surface and think you know everything there is to know." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. Her words felt like they were digging into him, pulling something out that he hadn't even realized was there. He had always been told that beauty was something to be admired, something to strive for, but hearing her speak about it this way made everything feel wrong. Everything he had been taught felt like a lie. "You think you know what it means to be beautiful, but you're only looking at the image." She continued, her voice still low and controlled. "Beauty isn't power, it's a facade, a shield, nothing more." Mark's head spun with the weight of her words. He had never heard anyone speak like this before, and the more she spoke, the more unsettled he became, because part of him knew that she was right, but the other part refused to accept it, refused to believe that something as simple as beauty could hold so much weight, so much power. "You're wrong," he blurted out before he could stop himself. The words left his mouth with a force that surprised even him. Beauty can be something real, it can be something more than just a tool. Zylra finally turned her head to face him fully, her eyes locking onto his. And for the first time, Mark saw something in them, something that wasn't just cold distance. There was a flicker of something deeper, something almost sad, and she said simply, "Prove it." Mark felt the challenge in her words reverberate through him. He had barely processed the weight of her statement when it hit him that she was daring him to prove something to her, something far beyond a simple compliment or casual conversation. There was a deeper expectation in her gaze that he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about beauty anymore. It was about something more intangible, something that made his stomach churn with unease. He swallowed hard, his mind racing with possible responses, but every idea felt inadequate. He wasn't sure what kind of proof she was looking for, what kind of answer could he give to someone who saw beauty as a tool to be discarded, to someone who didn't believe in the surface-level ideals he had grown up with. And yet her challenge hung in the air. It felt like a test, one that could shatter everything he thought he knew about the world around him. And about her, he tried to steady his breath and finally managed to speak. "How do you want me to prove it?" His voice came out quieter than he intended, almost tentative. But she didn't seem to care about the tone of his question. She simply gave a small nod, her gaze unwavering. "Show me that you understand beauty isn't just something to be controlled or manipulated," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Show me that you see what lies beneath it." Mark didn't know what she meant by beneath it, but something in the way she said the words made him feel like she was asking him to see something about her, something no one else had been able to understand, not even the other powerful figures who circled around her like moths to a flame. He wanted to tell her that he understood, that he could see beyond the surface, that beauty was something pure, something untainted by manipulation. But he didn't know if he truly believed that, not in the way she was asking him to believe it. And that realization hit him like a cold wave. He wasn't sure he could prove anything to her, because the very concept she had challenged was something he was still grappling with himself. He felt trapped in his own thoughts for a moment, unsure of what to do or say. And then the room seemed to grow quiet. The noise of the diplomats and traders around them faded into the background. And for the first time he realized that it wasn't just her beauty that commanded the room. It was the way she carried herself, the way she could make everything feel still, as if she were in control of the entire space without lifting a finger. That was her true power. And that power wasn't about beauty at all. It was about something deeper, something that he still didn't fully understand. Mark took a deep breath and stepped closer to her for a moment. He wondered if he was being foolish. But he couldn't back down now. He had asked for this challenge. He had walked into it with eyes wide open. So he had to see it through. He searched for the right words. But they didn't come easily. And then he did something unexpected. He reached out gently toward the table beside her, his fingers brushing the edge of a holographic display, and the soft hum of the screen coming to life under his touch. A simple gesture felt oddly intimate, a human touch, connecting with a device that had been placed before him. And in that quiet moment, as he looked at her again, he spoke not to her directly, but to the space between them. Maybe beauty isn't something to be proven or measured by anyone but the one who sees it. His words were hesitant, but they were his own, and in them, he hoped, there was something real, something she could understand. Zara's eyes flickered ever so slightly at Mark's words, but she didn't speak at first. Instead, she simply watched him, as though assessing every movement, every thought that passed through his mind. Mark felt the weight of her gaze like an invisible force pressing down on him. And for a moment, he wondered if he had said the wrong thing, if he had completely missed the mark. But then her lips parted just enough to let a soft breath escape, and the silence between them stretched longer than he expected before she finally spoke. Her voice was quieter now, less distant, more contemplative. "You are not wrong," she said slowly, as though testing the truth of the words as they left her mouth. "Beauty is not meant to be proven nor controlled, but to understand that is something few ever dare to do." Mark felt a strange warmth creep into his chest at her admission. It was the first time she had spoken to him without that edge of coldness that had been present since their first meeting. And yet there was something still distant about her, something that made it hard for him to fully grasp where she stood. Her next words came with a hint of something like bitterness, or maybe regret. "You see beauty in a way most others do, but it is still a limited view. You think it is a reflection of strength or power, something to be admired. But you don't see how it is used to manipulate and control, how it molds the expectations of an entire society, the expectations that even you follow without ever questioning them." Mark's chest tightened with the sting of her words. She wasn't just challenging his thoughts on beauty, she was tearing apart everything he had believed about the world. How could he have been so blind? How had he never thought of it? That way he had always admired beauty in the form of art or nature, or even the people he met along his travels. But he had never considered how it could be used as a weapon or a currency traded to shape the thoughts of others. He had never considered how deeply embedded it was in everything he had been taught. The world around him had shaped him in ways he hadn't fully understood, until now. Zara took a small step toward him, as if sensing the shift in his thoughts, and for the first time he noticed a subtle vulnerability in her expression. It was fleeting, but it was there, a crack in the armor of someone who had learned to wield beauty as both shield and sword. She lowered her gaze for a moment, and when she looked back up there was something softer in her eyes. "I was taught the same way you were, Mark." She said, his name now hanging in the air between them like an invitation or a question. "But I learned to reject it. I had to learn to discard the idea that beauty could define who I was or what I could do." She paused, her voice growing quieter. "It was never meant to be a tool of power. It was meant to be something free, but it was stolen from us long ago." Mark felt his heart race with curiosity and empathy. Her words were a window into something far deeper than he had ever imagined, and for the first time he felt like he was starting to understand her, starting to see the person behind the enigmatic beauty he had once admired so blindly. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could find the right words, Zylra stepped back slightly, her gaze hardening once again. "You still have much to learn, Mark, and I am not the one to teach you everything you seek." Her voice had returned to its usual coolness, and once again, Mark felt like he had crossed some invisible line between them, a line that had been drawn long before they had ever met. And no matter how much he wanted to push past it, he knew that he couldn't simply wade into the depths of her past and expect easy answers. It wasn't just beauty that held power here. It was the weight of untold histories and unspoken burdens that no one could truly understand without living them. And for a moment, Mark wondered if he was brave enough to face what lay beneath the surface. Mark stood there, caught between the distance she had put between them and the undeniable urge to push forward, to uncover more, to understand why Zylra seemed so consumed by the concept of beauty and its power in the world. He had always seen beauty as something simple, something to admire, and perhaps even something to desire. But now, after hearing her speak, he was left with more questions than answers. He wanted to ask her more. He wanted to learn everything she knew about the hidden truths of her species and the galaxy's understanding of beauty. But there was something else, a deep hesitation that kept him from speaking further. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something dangerous, something he wasn't fully prepared for. Zylra sensed his hesitation, and for a brief moment she studied him with a look that seemed to pierce through his defenses, her silver eyes gleaming with something like recognition, but also something darker, as if she saw his struggle and yet didn't care to offer any comfort. "You want to know the truth, don't you?" she said, her voice steady, but edged with a challenge. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat, because in that moment he realized that it wasn't just the truth about beauty that he was after. It was the truth about her, the truth about what she had experienced. The weight of her words had cut deeper than he had expected, and he didn't know if he was prepared to face what lay beyond them. But he didn't back down. He nodded slowly, and she seemed to acknowledge it with a small tilt of her head. "It isn't something you can learn just by asking questions, Mark," she continued, her voice lower now, almost a whisper. "It's something you have to experience, something you have to feel for yourself before you can truly understand." Mark frowned, slightly unsure of what she meant by that, but before he could ask, she took a step back, and the room seemed to shift with her movement. The energy in the lounge was palpable. Now the air was charged with an almost electric hum, as if the very walls were reacting to her presence. "I think it's time for you to leave now," she said, her tone abrupt and final, as if she had closed a door between them. He stood frozen for a moment as the weight of her words sank in. He had come here with the hope of gaining some kind of insight, but now it felt like she was shutting him out again. The walls that had briefly seemed to soften between them had risen back up with impenetrable force. But he couldn't let it end like this. He couldn't let her dismiss him without truly understanding what he was seeking. He stepped forward quickly before he could second-guess himself. "Please, Zylra, I need to understand more," he said, his voice quiet but urgent. "I don't know what you mean by feel it for yourself, but I want to know. I want to understand the truth." She glanced at him, and for a moment there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, maybe even pity. But it was gone as soon as it appeared, her face returning to its usual cold composure. "You think you can handle the truth?" she asked softly. "You think you are ready to see things the way I do?" Mark met her gaze steadily, and despite the storm of emotions swirling in his chest, he nodded once more, this time with certainty. "Yes," he said simply. "I want to understand the way you see the world." Zylra studied him in silence for a long moment before she gave the slightest nod, almost imperceptible, and yet Mark felt the shift in her energy. It was like a decision had been made, and something deep within him stirred with the anticipation of what was to come. "Then come with me," she said, her voice finally softening just a fraction, "and maybe you will begin to see." Mark's heart raced as Zylra turned and began to walk away, her silver figure cutting through the crowd like a blade. He hesitated for only a moment before following her through the shifting sea of people, his thoughts a whirlwind of anticipation and uncertainty. What did she mean by seeing the world the way she did? What was she going to show him? Would it be the truth he was seeking, or something darker, something he wasn't prepared to face? His footsteps were almost silent as he kept pace behind her. Her presence was like a pull of gravity that made it difficult to focus on anything else. The diplomats and traders in the lounge barely spared a glance at the two of them as they moved through the room, their attention still fixed on their own deals and negotiations. But to Mark it felt like the entire space had shifted, like the universe was suddenly aware of their movement. He could feel the weight of her words from their last conversation, still heavy on his mind. He wanted to understand beauty and power the way she did, but a small part of him feared what that understanding might cost him. They walked through the corridors of the station in silence, each step echoing in Mark's ears, the soft hum of machinery and distant chatter filling the background. But there was an overwhelming sense of stillness between them, as if they were the only two people in the galaxy. Zylra led him to a private elevator at the far end of the hall, and he followed her inside. The doors slid shut with a soft hiss, and the air inside felt different, colder, quieter. Mark could feel his pulse quicken as the elevator began its descent. The walls of the small space were lined with sleek metallic panels and holographic screens. But it wasn't the elevator's design that had his attention, it was Zylra. She stood perfectly still, her hands folded loosely at her sides, but her posture was tense, as if she was preparing for something. She glanced at him, only briefly, before turning her attention back to the floor. The silence stretched on between them until Mark couldn't stand it anymore. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice slightly strained. The question felt stupid as soon as it left his lips, because he already knew that wherever they were going, it wasn't going to be a simple conversation. It was going to be something more, something that would change everything. But still he had to ask. "You'll see soon enough," she replied, her voice low and distant. There was no warmth in her words, only the cool detachment that had come to define her presence. Mark tried to make sense of her response, but before he could speak again, the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and they stepped into a dimly lit corridor. The walls were lined with strange symbols and holographic displays that flickered and shifted as they passed by. Mark's eyes darted around, trying to make sense of the unfamiliar sights. But there was a strange heaviness in the air here, as if they were stepping into a place beyond the reach of ordinary travelers. The atmosphere felt thick and charged with something Mark couldn't quite put his finger on. And yet Zylra seemed completely at ease as she led him deeper into the station. The further they walked, the more Mark felt like they were moving away from everything he knew, from the familiar world of deals and trade, and into something much older, something far more ancient. The corridor twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense. The walls seemed to breathe with a strange energy, and Mark found himself increasingly disoriented. But Zylra never hesitated. She moved with purpose, as though she had walked these halls 1,000 times before and knew exactly where she was going. Eventually, they reached a door at the end of the corridor, and Zylra turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. For the first time since they had entered the elevator, there was something different in her gaze now, a flicker of something that might have been pity or perhaps sympathy. But it was gone before he could read it fully. She placed her hand on the door, and it slid open with a smooth hum, revealing a room bathed in soft blue light. The room was unlike anything Mark had ever seen. It was vast and empty, but there was a strange beauty to it. The walls were lined with translucent panels that shimmered in the soft blue light. The air smelled faintly of something ancient, a mixture of dust and energy that hadn't been disturbed for centuries. And at the center of the room was an object that caught his eye. It was a large crystalline structure glowing faintly in the dim light. Its shape was intricate and fluid, almost like a living thing. And as Mark approached it, he felt a strange pull in his chest, an overwhelming sense that this object held some deep significance, something far beyond his comprehension. Zylra stood at the far side of the room, watching him closely, her gaze intense, as though she were waiting for him to make sense of it all. Mark stepped closer to the crystal, unsure of what he was supposed to do with it. As his fingers hovered over its surface, the room seemed to hum in response, a soft vibration traveling through the air, and up his arm he pulled his hand back instinctively. But Zara's voice cut through the tension, breaking the silence. "Do you feel it?" she asked, her tone softer now, almost inviting. He didn't know how to answer, because he could feel it, a deep pull, something inside him responding to the crystal's presence. But he didn't understand why or what it meant. "What is this?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is what you came for," Zylra said, stepping closer to him, her voice calm, but tinged with something Mark couldn't quite place. "This is the truth that was hidden from you, and from your people for so long." Mark looked at her, his mind racing, trying to piece together the pieces, but it wasn't enough. He needed more answers. "I don't understand," he admitted, the words spilling out without thinking. "I thought you wanted to understand," she replied, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You wanted to know the truth about beauty and power, didn't you?" Mark nodded, the weight of her question pressing on him, but his mind was still clouded with confusion and doubt. "Then this is the truth," she said with finality as she stepped forward and placed her hand on the crystal. The room seemed to react to her touch, the energy around them shifting and pulsing in time with her movements. "Beauty is not just what you see. It is not simply an image or a weapon. It is something deeper. It is a force that shapes the very fabric of reality," she continued, her voice now filled with a quiet reverence. "The crystal holds the knowledge of the ancients, the ones who first understood the true nature of beauty and power." She turned to Mark and met his gaze, her eyes intense and full of something unspoken. "What you see as beauty is only a shadow of what it truly is. It is an energy and essence that connects all living things. It is a part of the universe itself, and it has the power to create and destroy." Mark felt the weight of her words settle deep within him. It was as if the very air around him had shifted, and he could feel the truth of what she said without fully understanding it. He looked at the crystal again, and for the first time it didn't seem just like an object. It seemed alive, pulsing with a kind of awareness that made his skin crawl. And yet in that same moment, he felt something else, something warm and inviting, something that whispered to him from deep within the core of his being. "You cannot control it," Zylra said, her voice firm. "You cannot harness it for your own gain. It is not a tool, it is a force. And if you truly understand it, you will know that it is not to be wielded, it is to be respected." Mark swallowed hard as he took in her words. They were more than a lesson, they were a warning. And yet he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of awe in the presence of the crystal. He reached out again, his fingers brushing the surface of the glowing structure. And in that moment, the entire room seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, and the light dimmed, as though the universe itself was holding its breath.